Luther King doctrine. And she serves as the scholar in residence also at the Cathedral of the AME Metropolitan Church in Washington, D.C. But she is in Boston today, and we just so look forward to continuing our study of Dr. Howard Thurman and his theology and the pivotal role that he played in awakening America to civil rights. Spotlight you, just 1 second here.
All right.
Okay, wait a minute.
All right. Well, good morning, Bradley Hills. I'm so happy to be back with you a year later and to continue talking about Howard Thurman. It's really a gift to join you virtually. Technology allows many things to happen that are good, as well as many things that are inconvenient. But I am appreciative of the good today. So thank you so much for inviting me back and for us having a Thurman conversation. I love the title. So the working title we were working with as we were talking about this through email was Howard Thurman Part 2. And so to say Part 2 is to say we left much undone and unstated, or much that is yet to be explored in talking about Howard Thurman. And so I am excited to maybe take up a piece that wasn't as obvious last year about Thurman. So let me share my screen and then I'll tell you what we're going to do today. This year, I want to pick up on our conversations of engaging with Howard Thurman by telling a little known story, a story that is not very well known, about a multi-year series of conversation exchanges between Howard Thurman and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. This started all from the site of the White House in 1944 and would extend into both of their lives in some unique ways. So for this time, I want to tell you this story pretty much in pictures of this conversation exchange between Thurman, who is serving as dean at Howard University at the time, and then Eleanor Roosevelt, who is first lady, living in the White House in DC at the time, and hopefully as a way to begin to explore Thurman's notion of the connecting links of fellowship, the connecting links of fellowship. Thurman was a masterful wordsmith. If you've read anything of his, from Jesus and the Disinherited, to his Meditations of the Heart, to Deep is the Hunger, to his memoir, Footprints of a Dream, as he talks about the founding of Fellowship Church, which we will get to today, you will realize he knew how to use words, how to employ and deploy words, how he knew how to bend words to make new meanings. So Thurman understood words to be the carriers of meanings and meaning potentials. He played with words and tested them for significance. In his 1971 autobiography, With Head and Heart, reflecting back on his decades-long writing career, preaching career, teaching career, Thurman claims that words are his vocational craft. He says this, quote, "Though I have published these and other books, my craft remains the spoken word. Even when I am writing, I hear the sound of words as they go on the page. If the sound does not please me, I am reluctant to write the words down." Sally McFay, a theologian in 1982, would write a book called Metaphorical Theology. And I think she would have described Thurman's use of words in conversations about God and divine and what is holy and what is most significant by talking about Thurman as a wordsmith embodying a relational dynamic. This is what she says about words, metaphors, as having relational power. She says to be a human is to interpret, to think of this in relationship to that, to make judgments concerning similarity and difference, to think metaphorically. One of the Thurman's phrases for playing with relationships, for making links and connections between this and that, for getting people to see something they had never seen before, for getting people to revisit the meaning of a word, only to envision what its meaning potential may be for their relationships to themselves, to God, to each other. One of the phrases Thurman loved to use is the language of connecting links. The language of connecting links for Thurman was a tool for him to deepen our understanding about what it means that we are not free radicals living in these sort of vacuums and silos, even though we live in a world that wants us to think about ourselves in that way, that the language of connecting links for Thurman was always about awakening the work that we need to do to connect to each other, to relate to each other, to find, another title of one of his books, common ground with one another so that we might have fellowship. Two of my favorite quotes from him where he's using the language of connecting links in Meditations of the Heart is right here before you. The first one, here he says, there are some lives that seem ever to be channels, connecting to be channels, canals through which things flow. They are connecting links between other people, movements, purposes. They make the network by which all kinds of communications are possible. This quote is taken from his meditation called Canal and Reservoir, and he's inviting his readers and his listeners to imagine what is their vocational work in the world and how are they doing it. And here again is this language of connecting link as an important work to be done. The second one is taken from his meditation on Holy One, and he says, Lord, I want to be more holy in my words. Words are my common tools of communication. All that many know of me are the words used as connecting links between my inward parts and theirs. That's so important. He sees words as being ones that connect us not just to each other in the external or exterior or material world, but that words have the power to connect our interior selves to each other. Indeed, he sees those as tools by which of doing this necessary work. So I want to tell you a story about a Thurman connecting link moment or series of moments, a story that most people don't know. I actually had to go and find this story for myself, working in the archives here at Boston University, and also developing relationships with the Presidential Roosevelt Library and making trips there to retrieve some of these letter correspondences and exchanges. So it really was a reconstructive research adventure for me. I was able to share part of this research with the White House Historical Association, and it is actually occupying my forthcoming my book on Howard Thurman. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this conversation as an example. So you get to kind of get to have a little bit of a taste of this research that I was able to reconstruct. So I hope you enjoy it. I'll tell you the story, and then we can do some Q&A at the end, just to unpack some of the things that you might hear. What I really want you to pay attention to is the work of connecting link imagery and language. So in what ways does this story enact, embody, represent the kind of connecting link work that Thurman thinks is essential for a world that is built upon establishing new common grounds, new relationships that he sees as lasting and significant. So join me in this story. In 1944, Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady living in the executive mansion of the United States, located as it has been since 1800 under the presidency of John Adams on Pennsylvania Avenue in the District of Columbia. Situated approximately 4 miles away from the White House on the historically Black college and university campus of Howard University in that same year, we find the first dean of Howard University's Rankin Chapel, Dr. Howard Thurman. Thurman had made a name for himself nationally and internationally while going about his task of cultivating spaces for the life of the mind and the journey of the spirit for Howard students, faculty, administrators, and the broader DC community. That year, in 1944, First Lady Roosevelt entered a sort of pen pal exchange with this dean. Driving the formal and conversational nature of their relationship was a pattern of letter exchange, or what I like to call, as a biblical scholar who focuses in on letters in the New Testament, an epistolary exchange. This relationship between First Lady Roosevelt and Dean Thurman in the literary form of letters would continue until the First Lady's death in November 1962. During the course of their 18-year correspondence exchange, Thurman transitioned from Dean of Howard University in Washington, D.C., to minister in residence of the Fellowship Church for All Peoples in San Francisco, California from 1944 to 1953. To become the first African-American, and then to go on to become the first African-American to hold a deanship position at a majority white institution, Boston University, from 1953 to 1963 or 65. Eleanor Roosevelt, Howard Thurman, and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, posted correspondence to each other annually about matters of race relations and social change, the cultural textures of the country, civil rights and democratic ideals, religion and spirituality, and they even sent literary gifts in the form of books, pamphlets, poems, and magazines to each other from time to time. The frequency of those exchanges differed over the course of their 18-year connection, and the correspondences from the First Lady herself were fairly short. But one conventional conversational thread persisted. They were allies in an endeavor to make the country more hospitable, more equitable, and more accessible to all its citizens. They had found and worked on their connecting link. And their letter exchanges functioned as their modes of connecting and conversing, starting with the correspondence mechanism of the White House in 1944. It showcased their joint effort to cross the racial, social, and class divides of the country. Permit me to offer you a little bit of context about Thurman in DC at Howard University in 1944. So by the time we are looking at Thurman in 1944 at Howard University, Howard Thurman has assumed the position of dean, in which he started in 1932, and it would be the platform that creates a series of connecting link relationships that will follow him for the rest of his life. So he joins Howard University as dean in 1932, and what we're paying attention to is what happens in 1944, but all that time leading up, 1932 to 1944, this platform, this place, Howard University, Thurman is doing a lot of work locally and internationally in terms of cultivating these connecting links. And while serving as dean, Thurman not only drew the attention of First Lady Roosevelt, but before they interacted formally, he led the first African-American delegation to India, Burma, Sri Lanka, and met Mahatma Gandhi with the support of the YMCA and YWCA international committees in 1935, another connecting link of relational power and significance that will follow Thurman. It would be the journey that thrust Thurman onto the international stage of geopolitics and human relations that cross cultural and religious divides. Here's another photo, series of photos. I'll explain to you what these photos represent. Thurman's notoriety as a university dean was pronounced. The August 1939 issue of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, profiled Thurman, calling him, quote, a preacher at large to the universities. The reporting journalist began the article by saying, so you can't see it here, so I'm going to read you this little first part right here, first paragraph of this column. It says, this title may be a bit misleading, for Howard Thurman is more than just a preacher and more than just a theologian. He is a philosopher, mystic, interpreter, student of learning, and a very human person all in one. And if he were not very human in understanding, if he could not draw very near to young college people, all the other things that he seems to be would count for little, end quote. In this same issue, so this is the official issue of the Crisis, in which and with the cover, Thurman's profile sketch, and then here's another article that's really important in this journal. In this same issue of the Crisis, only 4 pages past the Thurman feature, the editorial spotlighted none other than First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady had just given a speech at the 30th annual conference of the NAACP and presented the Spingarn Medal to Marian Anderson. The editorial in the Crisis magazine described the First Lady as, quote, a woman of great courage and of unusual foresight, end quote, who registered her convictions with, quote, force and persuasion. On the one hand, the Crisis highlights Dean Howard Thurman as a very human and understanding person. And on the other hand, only 4 pages later, it highlights First Lady Roosevelt as a human person of courage, foresight, and conviction. They are literally 4 pages and 4 miles away from each other in 1939 in Washington, D.C., and yet there is no extant trail of correspondence shared between them until almost 5 years later, when a mutual friend and confidant of both parties formally puts the wheels of exchange in motion with her own letter to First Lady Roosevelt, posted on May 26, 1944. So here's the question. How does the letter writing relationship, what I call an epistolary exchange between First Lady Roosevelt and Dean Thurman, begin in 1944 when they didn't even see each other in 1939, and they're literally right here? And how does it evolve over the course of that year? I am going to show you. While Roosevelt and Thurman knew each other by 1944, research in the archives of the Howard Thurman and Sue Bailey papers at Boston University and the Eleanor Roosevelt papers at FDR's Presidential Library reveals that a formal and ongoing correspondence exchange between them happened under the signature of Mary McLeod Bethune. By 1944, Bethune's organization, the National Council of Negro Women, was flourishing, and she had just completed her 7 years of service as director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, appointed by FDR. But it was Bethune's close relationship, even friendship, with First Lady Roosevelt and her shared Florida roots with Thurman that paved the way for them to correspond. Thurman grew up only a few miles away from Bethune at her school in Daytona, Florida. In his autobiography, With Head and Heart, Thurman describes the impact Mary McLeod Bethune had on him as a boy by saying, quote, as a boy growing up in Daytona, I was, of course, familiar with how Mary McLeod Bethune started her school, and I knew the mission she felt she was fulfilling. Mrs. Bethune knew Mama. by name, and whenever by chance she encountered me, she inquired about her. The very presence of the school and the inner strength and authority of Mrs. Bethune gave boys like me a view of possibilities to be realized in some distant future, end quote. Practiced in the art of connecting the First Lady to leading figures within the African American community on May 26, 1944, Bethune worked her magic again. She sent a letter to Roosevelt stating, quote, here's literally the quote from the letter. I regret that my illness will prevent my attendance at the dinner on Tuesday, May 30th, honoring Dean and Mrs. Howard Thurman and the interracial San Francisco Community Project to which they go in June. I am so happy that you are speaking on this occasion. I am personally interested, first, because the Thurmans are very, very dear to me. I have known Howard since babyhood. And second, the interracial church community will be getting a big send-off by your endorsement. I wanted you to know a little more about them, so I'm sending some materials which might be of help to you, end quote. In addition to her letter of recommendation for the Thurmans, Bethune included copies of the initial issues of the Afro-American Journal, of which Sue Bailey Thurman was editor-in-chief, and Bethune included the August 1939 NAACP issue of the Crisis that featured Thurman and First Lady. And so I'm taking you back to this slide. This is the issue that Bethune sent Roosevelt, that was in the archives under Eleanor Roosevelt's name under this whole letter correspondence. So this is the actual pictures of that, what she sent. Leveraging the Postal Service and the White House mail protocols, Bethune made the implicit point that Thurman and Roosevelt were already involved in the same conversation. They already had wielded the same connecting links. She set the wheels in motion for an epistolary relationship to form between Roosevelt and Thurman. And that relationship, bearing Bethune's seal of approval, deepened both of their commitments to American citizenship, inclusion of all peoples, and the freedoms of speech, assembly, religion, and the right to a fair trial. Interestingly, about a month earlier, on April 25th, Dean Thurman sent the First Lady his own letter of introduction from the office of the Dean of Howard University. In the letter, he requests a meeting to introduce his new venture. He says, I am writing to request the privilege of a 30-minute conference with you at your convenience relative to the launching of an interracial, interdenominational church in San Francisco, to which I have been called, along with Dr. Alfred Fisk of the Department of Philosophy at the San Francisco College. Thurman reflects on this initial meeting in his memoir about the founding of America's first interracial, intercultural, and interreligious church. In his memoir, The Footprints of a Dream, Thurman says, when I saw her, she was most gracious and gave to me the kind of encouragement that is so expressive of her amazing gift of intimacy. So to review, Thurman and Roosevelt are both featured in the August 1939 issue of The Crisis, but 5 years pass before they meet in person, first at Thurman's request in April 1944. Following that meeting, Bethune writes an additional letter of recommendation to the First Lady on the Thurmans' behalf in May, and on the last day of May 1944, the First Lady offers a testimonial at Thurman's farewell banquet in which she counsels, quote, it is so much harder to combat discrimination and prejudice among older people because they have become set in their emotional habits. She encourages the Thurmans to look to the children as the starting point of change in American social relations. The day after Dean Thurman's farewell banquet, as they are heading to San Francisco, First Lady Roosevelt ended her popular syndicated column, My Day, with these words. Yesterday, I had a group of Democratic women lunch with me in the garden, very informally. In the evening, I went for a short time to a dinner given to Dean Howard Thurman before his departure for San Francisco, where he has accepted a joint Black and white pastorate of the Fellowship Church. Later in the summer, on August 24th, oh, and this picture, this is the photo from that banquet, so that May 1944 banquet. Later in the summer, on August 24th, 1944, the Thurmans sent the First Lady a letter updating her on their intercultural experiment and programming. In that correspondence, they invited her to join the membership as an associate member at large and described their children's summer camp in which they had followed Roosevelt's suggestion. Thurman's report reads, Wednesday of next week, August 30th, we close our fellowship camp school. Many times during these weeks, I thought about your suggestion relative to beginning with the children. Our school has an average attendance of 48 children made up of 4 racial communities: Filipino, Mexican, white, and Black. The age range is from 5.5 to 13. The program content is built around one of the racial groups making up American life, including American Indigenous peoples, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Russian Americans, Jewish Americans, Mexican Americans, Filipino Americans, and African Americans. Thurman goes on to say, the stories, games, and as far as possible, the crafts use the culture of these various peoples. We do not know how significant ultimately this program is, but we are convinced that during the 8 weeks, there has been a softening of attitudes and a widening of cultural horizons for most of the children. The First Lady, she was so compelled by this social experiment in intercultural and interracial human relations in which Thurman took her advice and started with the children that less than a month later, on September 14th, 1944, she responded to Thurman's request with her own connecting link. In 2 short sentences, she writes, Dear Mr. Thurman, of course, I am glad to join your fellowship church movement, and I enclose my pledge. I am also sending a small check, and I am glad to know everything is going well. In October of 1944, Thurman mailed Roosevelt a report describing the camp and its impact. The pamphlet describing the fellowship community called it a creative venture in interracial and intercultural communions. So it's at this point that I love to make my great reveal, and that is, how close were they? This formidable First Lady living at the White House in 1944 and Dean and pioneer of American human relations in religious life, Howard Thurman. In the end, the series of letters or epistolary conversations between the First Lady and Dean cannot be characterized as deeply personal correspondence. Rather, they represent an exchange between the First Lady or first spouse of the Executive House of the United States, and not just Howard Thurman, the dean, but Howard Thurman, the academic, the pastor, and human being. They find common ground, to use the title of one of Thurman's many books, in their joint investment in an American human relations project that creates proximities and fellowship that transgress ethnicities and cultures, gender, religion, class. I am not sure we can call them friends in the same way we would Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune were surely friends, but we certainly can call them supporters of a common dream. Each in their own way, Thurman and Roosevelt attempted to infuse into the fabric of the American experience new conversations about the American project that outpaced their initial 1944 series of exchanges. Their literary conversations endured beyond Bethune's passing in 1955, and their epistolary exchanges linked them as associates and sympathizers to each other and their endeavors for 18 years. All of this culminated in their collaboration on the Committee of Inquiry into the Administration of Justice and the Freedom Struggle, which Roosevelt chaired, and Dean Howard Thurman of Boston University served as a committee member through her passing in 1962. In a letter addressed to Thurman just a little over a year before Mrs. Roosevelt invited him to lunch in New York to, quote, take action in the very real crisis confronting CORE and their proposition that America is one country and that what injures one of us diminishes us all, that each of us must take action to establish the American ideal. Thurman's response to the former First Lady's convictions and ideas is captured most profoundly in his inscription to her in his 1959 book publication called Footprints of a Dream. He says this: to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, from whom one of the first real urges to this adventure came. And what you have before you is the actual copy of the book that he sent her with his inscription to her that is archived in the FDR Presidential Library. In the distance between 4 pages and 4 miles, former First Lady Roosevelt and Dean Howard Thurman struck up a formal letter conversation in which they shared the dream of the fellowship community in society, church, and education, and espoused the American ideal that normal relationships between people would be that of fellowship, understanding, and confidence rather than distrust, prejudice, and strife. Thurman would go on to call these normal relationships between people the connecting links by which the human spirit and the human urge shall thrive and flourish. May we be encouraged in the idea of what it means to use our words, to connect with people, to find common ground, to establish relationships that encourage others to find common ground so that we all might be, as Thurman says, connected one to another. That is my story that I wanted to give you today, just to think about what it means in this Howard Thurman Part 2, what it means to see as some of the work that we might do this year, this work of connecting links as a part of fellowship. So in a course of a year, 1944, Eleanor Roosevelt and Thurman found common ground and established and cultivated a relationship for the common good of all people. And I think that that's something inspiring to reflect on in 2024 as we begin this year together. I think this is the time for conversation. So I would be interested to hear what you heard from this that you found interesting, new, inspiring, or what potential clarifications I might give to you in sharing this story.
Thank you so much. Do we have a question here from the audience? I'm very moved by what you have shown us, because I think many of us may have had pen pals in the past.
That's right.
There is something about the word, that exchange of thought, of feeling, that is revealed when you're in that kind of a correspondence with another person, that it
That's right.
can reach a deeper dimension even than we feel in a face-to-face, whatever little bit of time we have in a conversation. And I know we at Bradley Hills are seeking to be more aware of what justice is and how we can relate to the other. So I do feel like this is very, very timely and appreciate who knew? I mean, I actually think historically this is a revelation that we didn't know that Thurman and Roosevelt had this relationship. So it's very
This
interesting. Wondering if
it seems to
others.
Yeah, it seems to me, Sister Carol, you're bringing up some really, really good points about that I just want to underscore that I think is part of this work. One is to recognize, to raise the question, I think, for us of the power of communication, the power of words, be it orally or the written words, to cultivate relationships that don't have to, again, I say there's no evidence that Roosevelt and Thurman became, these deep sharing secret friends. What they found common ground and conversation with was this larger commitment about the American idea, the American citizenry, what it means to treat each other well as human beings and dignity. And that letter correspondence started in 1944 and that would continue. It's always committed to that. It's committed to the shared values of what it means to see each other all made in, the image of God and having a fellowship with one another, this deep connecting link. And what I find so inspiring about that is or maybe the demand on us of saying, what are we using the written word or the spoken word to do in connecting with each other and sharing common values of what it means to be human with each other, right? And to not miss that you don't always have to go know each other's secret for there to be a good, viable secrets, a good, viable relationship that does something good for others, in which we are supporting the projects of fellowship building and of connecting links. The other piece I really love about that is, and I think we miss this in our technology age with emails and text messages, is, the time it takes to write a letter, right? To write a letter by hand, and then to send it to each other, and the kind of regard and that whole process, when you think about 1944 and going forward, really does show another layer of discipline and commitment as well. I'll tell you a little, another fact that common people would not necessarily, like common people in the sense of it's just not typical knowledge about Eleanor Roosevelt. Apparently, First Lady Roosevelt's handwriting was horrible. And so, and so I was literally working with the archivist at the presidential library. And so we would looking through all of these correspondence, and we were like, okay, that she had a series of amanuenses and writers and transcriptionists because her writing was horrible. And so there were a couple of pieces where she actually wrote it herself, and we were like all scrunched over the table trying to figure out what she said. And so that's part of the fun, was sort of getting to know these sort of tendencies of the two. The other piece I don't want to miss, the player in this, is Sue Bailey Thurman. So another part of the correspondence chain between them wasn't just Howard Thurman and Roosevelt. It also was Sue Bailey Thurman and Eleanor Roosevelt, Sue
His
Bailey
wife.
Thurman and Mary McLeod Bethune as well. So I have just as many correspondences in that configuration as well. So what does it mean to think about these connecting links and relational circles as involving more than just these one-on-one individuals? I mean, there is literally a web of relationships involved in this common connecting link experiment and relationship between Roosevelt and Thurman that we don't want to miss. So I'll stop it there to see if there's any other questions or insights, aha moments for you.
Move over here so we can hear you. Yeah.
So thank you very much. What a powerful presentation. My question is, you had mentioned that he had international as well as local connections and outreach, and you mentioned those international thought leaders that he was connected with. But regarding the local, in San Francisco or in Boston, in these urban areas, that web that you talk about and the fellowship, what were some of those kind of local connections, and who did he network with? and what did they do in order to establish some of these local connections and fellowship opportunities?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you for asking me this. Now I have to be very careful not to go into a rabbit hole. If I talk about, if I talk about that. Right. So it's like, let's be very careful that we're on a time limit here. So in terms of DC, so Thurman's relationships in DC were most notably and incredibly related to the religious world of DC. So Thurman, one of the features of Thurman's inaugural deanship of Howard University Rankin Chapel was how he was innovating on worship experiences. And so he'll talk about this in his with head and heart, these innovations, how he was courageously bringing in liturgical dance, how he was courageously using different kinds of music and art and bringing in artists and having art displays as a part of the worship experience. He was also bringing in crafting the Rankin Chapel as an interreligious space. So he used that as a way to build relationships with other religious leaders in the DC area, from Muslim to Jewish to Hindu. So he was using the space to cultivate interreligious conversations and dialogues. He'll call them worship experiments, in fact. And so when I think about the local environment of Thurman in DC during his time from the 1930s into 1944, it is that work that he is in DC purposely pushing, crossing these sort of religious silos and community silos that were in place, and crafting new experiences of worship and faith life and community that would follow a lot of his students that experienced that beyond. That work would serve him when he gets to Boston. So in 1953, from 1953 to 1963, he would do a similar kind of thing in Marsh Chapel in Boston, from the learnings and the relationships that he started in DC from that time. The other will be the YMCA, the YWCA is the other space where he's finding a lot of relationships in DC. That's actually the relationship that ends up sponsoring the trips to India that they would end up doing. And so that's something there. San Francisco is interesting. To think about Thurman's time in San Francisco is to also deal with the matters of the Japanese internment camps and the fallout from that, and just the relational tensions in the city from that. And Fellowship Church ends up becoming a very important, I would say, response to those divisions in the city. So this, as you heard in his reflection about their first summer camp and all the diversity of communities that are typically worshiping separately, the children are there together, and that would include now the parents. And so this community in San Francisco, the Fellowship of All Churches, really becomes a critical response against those divisions, so much so that Thurman actually ends up, people don't talk about this, but it's his work in San Francisco, and quite frankly, the defiance of community reconstruction and work that he does there, that ends him actually on the FBI watch list. So he actually was being watched as an FBI file for the Fellowship Church and the work that he was doing there, standing against the war, standing against these segregation tactics and experiences. So last thing I will say about that, look at the connecting link from DC. What ends up happening is what he's doing in San Francisco. He has as members at large Eleanor Roosevelt, members at large, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Eleanor Roosevelt stays mindful of the church, so much so that she ends up getting, so this is a correspondence in the FDR archive, she ends up getting a letter from another church, interracial, interfaith church experiment up north. I want to say somewhere in Pennsylvania, but don't quote me on that. And Eleanor Roosevelt responds, I think in her own handwriting, to that by saying, well, have you ever, I appreciate what you're doing and support it, but have you ever heard of Fellowship Church in San Francisco? They are doing a mighty thing there that I support. I encourage you to look to them as a model. And so she's telling others about this work as well.
We have another question, Michael Gibson.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. It was fascinating. I think one of the things that we all have to appreciate, that a lot of us don't appreciate unless we study that period of time, is that at this period of time, the military was completely segregated. There were still, there was still segregation across the Deep South. White kids going to white schools and black kids going to black schools. And there, for Eleanor Roosevelt to have this relationship with these folks was really groundbreaking. And she went on to do some pretty amazing things, including when she would go around to during World War II, when she would go around to visit troops, she would always make a point of going to the the segregated African American units, and she even rode in the back of one of the black pilots' planes. So anyway, Tuskegee Airmen. So anyway, I just think that's an important point to raise, is that what we're talking about here was something that was really groundbreaking. This was not just some normal thing, but for her to take this active role was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and what I love about the active role is how it required time and effort. They're not conveniently located with each other. Their projects and platforms are different. They find these common ground connections. Also, one of my other favorite parts of this story, if you didn't pick up on it, was the role of Mary McLeod Bethune. And so Thurman had already met with Roosevelt earlier in the year, trying to build this relationship. Mary McLeod Bethune had deep relationships and proximity to both of them, and really saw her role in this as being one that signed off on it and really gave a certain degree of this is right. You all need to have a relationship and support each other's project. And it always makes me think about the work of always needing to have those wise forces that have relationships. I mean, so that have already created some bridges, right? Who are also saying, this is a new bridge, a new link that absolutely will serve the world well, right? And so I continue to keep coming back to her role of writing the letters of recommendation and commendation that both of them needed to know that they needed to go forward in forging this common ground conversation and work together. Other questions?
I have a question. Yeah. Did they ever address, I mean, this was during the time when the civil rights movement was obviously gaining strength. Did they ever address that in their correspondence?
Yeah, so one of the things that CORE, so and what is it? The Committee of Inquiry into the Administration, is that right? No, CORE. They both ended up serving on CORE together. It's a morning, so someone remind me of CORE. So the Coalition of Racial
Congress of Racial Equality.
That's what I need. Congress of Racial Equality. They both ended up serving on that in capacity. So Eleanor Roosevelt actually was a chair lady for one of the units, and Thurman was in the advising role on the advisory board, of course. So you have these exchanges on CORE letterhead where Roosevelt is writing Roosevelt is writing Thurman to say, this is a luncheon that's happening. This is activity that's happening. Be aware of the struggle. This is the sit-in that's happening. And he's writing back saying, I'm aware of it. I will be going to this event. So they were corresponding about the work of CORE during a really important time, with Roosevelt leading again in a particular leadership role, and Thurman serving because of her leadership in this and offering his wisdom and advice. And remember, Thurman ends up being called the pastor of the civil rights movement itself. So in addition to the CORE work, Thurman is also a sort of advisory, spiritual advisor for King and so forth and so on as this continues to go on. So this relationship towards social justice really has some concrete organizing aspects to it that's important.
Other comments, questions? Well, yeah, I think there are a number of issues. I mean, I just was rereading this morning about Jesus and the disinherited, and Thurman talks about how oftentimes we as Christians try to provide service, but in the way that we provide service, we're really disconnected. It's not a genuine
That's right.
relationship, fellowship. And he talks all the time about the fellowship of believers, the fellowship of that Christ tried to build. And just the way that he uses his words to describe some of the attitudes that we think we have, that we're doing the right thing, that can be taken by the other, by the person that's receiving it, as really being quite condescending and breaks those relationships. Did you want to say a little bit more about, I mean, the Fellowship Church obviously was his ideal model for having a church that built on that model, but he was active for so many years in so many ways. I just thought,
Yeah, I love it. I mean, so thank you, Sister Carol. I think there's a couple of things here. One is, did you catch the part where Eleanor Roosevelt ends up telling him at his going away party, I really don't think you need to spend too much time with old people because they're set in their attitudinal habits. Right? And that's the quote. They are set in their attitudinal habits. You need to start.
Here we are.
All right. And Thurman takes that to heart and goes to Fellowship Church, and the programming there is focused first and foremost on creating these new proximities for the children, right? And he sees those experiments and that kind of programming being successful in the very particular language you actually used it, a lessening of attitudes. There was a lessening of attitudes and expanding of horizons. Food, as they continue to do programming and have fellowship table gatherings, they would create these blended cultural experiences that became a common part of some of the programming that he was doing. And so for Thurman, some of this work really is getting the attitudes down so that proximity can do its work. Like people can see the common humanity in each other that is counter to the way the larger society has segregated and segregated the communities. It's actually interesting. This made me think of another part. Thurman's book, The Luminous Darkness, an interpretation of the anatomy of segregation. He talks specifically about this matter. And what could be missed is for Thurman to talk about segregation means you must also talk about separation. They are two sides of the same thing. So segregation is a forced setting aside of one group for one group and another. But one group has the privilege, the entitlement, the norm to be able to move in and out of the segregated communities world, but the segregated community cannot move in and out freely without reprimand, without censure, without backlash into the other. He calls that separation, right? So there's one thing to talk about segregation, where there is a group that has power, another group that is required to basically stay in their world. But the separated class, the separated group still has free reign to move in and out of the world. One of the things that I think really you ended up seeing, and I think it was Brother Gibson, who brings this out of, I think something that he admired about Roosevelt was the ways in which she used her separated class privilege and entitlement, the fact that she can freely move into these African-American communities and out without reprimand while they cannot do the same, as ways to open up the horizons, not so much for the African American communities, but for her separated class communities, to say there is work we are supposed to do in terms of bringing proximity back. And he really saw that work of hers, that bringing together, that crossing, using her power, privilege, access, and entitlement to not just cross over, but to bring communities closer together as a part of a model of his fellowship church. That so much so that he inscribes the book. He has to send her an inscribed book where he says that much of the work of fellowship church is to your credit, and there's other correspondences there. So I always think about Thurman's sense of the segregated world. This is not just about segregation, it's also about separation, and what these two groups that have different kinds of freedoms and movement patterns can do with that. He's always trying to enact in his programming at Fellowship a kind of defiance, right? A social defiance to those divisions by helping people to share space and get to know each other in their similarities and their differences.
Questions, comments? You've given us so much to ponder about and to be grateful for, that we are still at least maintaining our relationship with you and your voices, because you have so much to fill us with and be with.
So I know we're running on time. I will leave you with this, because I think it's really, I always think this is a really important point for Thurman, even when we're talking about his sort of activism, his proximity to someone who was clearly politically and socially activist, as someone like Eleanor Roosevelt or Mary McLeod Bethune, is to remember, especially since it's Bradley Hills Presbyterian Church and we are faith community, Thurman sees this work as a necessity of the faith life, of the spiritual life. So he's not just doing social programming, this sort of defiant activist work as it's work that needs to be done, yes, for human relations. But what drives this for Thurman is that he does not have a sense that a healthy interior spiritual life is actionable or realizable if we are not attentive to and care about the external matters of social relationships, connections, and fellowships. Like to have a deep spiritual life that does not care about these social divisions and harms and inequities and injustice, that doesn't care about these different citizenships under the same banner of America, that some have certain rights and some don't. For him, that to not care about that is to not have a robust and deep spiritual life. And so the separation of the contemplative life, the inner life, to the exterior world does not exist for him in his spirituality. So I just want to say that what is the fuel that drives Thurman, even in these kinds of social connecting links, is he thinks that these are the products of a robust and deep spiritual and faith life, and we cannot miss that.
Well, we want to thank you so much. I know your writings and your thinking. I know you've written about Peter and the scriptural really commands that we get to unite the two in those readings. We have a lot of work that we can continue to do, and I hope we can continue the connection with you and with others that are also telling us we need to take action, we need to take courage, but we also need to be building on our inner spiritual life.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Next week, we'll be hearing from Robbie Jones, whose book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, has won a lot of attention nationwide. We're very fortunate that he can join us here at Bradley Hills as we as we continue to think about who we are and how we are as Christians today in the larger world as we reach out. And as we build those connections, but also as we look at segregated groups. So we have an exciting experience that he's able to join us. But also I would mention that Dr. Smith lives here a lot of the time too. So we hope this fellowship can continue with you as we continue our search, seeking, and we can't thank you enough for being with us and sharing with us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you.
Goodbye, everyone. Blessing.
Resonates with my
I was-
professional life. It's all about communication.
Right, yes.
Very
Yes, it
specifically,
is.
the written oral.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I do think it Thanks.
My dissertation project was the Blue Eagle campaign when FDR came into office, and the first thing that they staged was this national campaign, and they sent Kate Smith around the country singing "God Bless America." It was fascinating.
Yeah. You can't, we need to be reminded that these problems, these challenges have been with us for a long time.
Yeah. Scary how much we're
I know.
back there again.
It's more scary every day.
Really?
This has not been a good week for me. I'm like, oh no.
Especially thinking about young people and this whole book burning, book withdrawal thing. Instead of trying to get young people to come together, we're trying to be sure that they're protected from any idea.
I don't know what I would do now. I mean,
That would just make me so discouraged.
yeah.
Ben said she has a good friend up in New Jersey who's a librarian, and they have a couple of book clubs in their library, their little library. One of them is the banned book club. So they only read banned books.
That's great. Oh, wow.
It's a great article. I think it's in the paper maybe yesterday's about a book club in a bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina, that was contacted by a publisher of banned books. This publisher was in the business of supplying books to school libraries. And suddenly, the orders had been rescinded. So we got in touch with this bookstore and said, would you like to have these books? Can you distribute them, for free? So,
Wow.
the challenge, the opposite to banning books is redistributing.
Distributing these books. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, wow.
They really have to do that.
Yeah.
Everybody's having tech problems this morning. The library is too.
Oh, really?
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock and it's opening and having issues.
So,
I'm not gonna go to church. I've got to take care of this.
yeah, okay. Why is this in meeting for all? It's not, because I never know.